I still remember the exact sound of her voice when she said it. Not loud, not screaming. That was the worst part. She said it softly, almost pleasantly, the way you'd comment on the weather or mention that dinner was getting cold. She looked me directly in the eyes, smiled with half her mouth, and said, "You know, no one would notice if you simply weren't here anymore. You've always been a bit disposable." The room went quiet, not because everyone stopped talking, but because the specific corner of that restaurant, the corner where my husband's family had gathered to celebrate the engagement of his sister, Danielle, seemed to develop its own atmosphere. A pocket of frozen air. 7 people heard it. 7 people looked at their plates. And I said nothing. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, set it down with perfect control, and smiled back at her. That smile. I've thought about it many times since, because it wasn't a smile of surrender. It wasn't the smile of a woman who had been defeated and was hiding her tears behind good manners. It was something older than that, something she didn't have the experience to recognize. It was the smile of a woman who already knew how the story ended. Let me tell you who I am, not who Danielle thought I was. Not who my husband's family assumed I was when I first walked through their door 7 years ago, young and quiet, and dressed in clothes that didn't announce themselves. Let me tell you who I actually am, because that is the only way any of what followed will make sense. My name is Caroline Whitfield. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the daughter of a man who repaired appliances and a woman who kept the books for 3 local businesses out of a desk in our kitchen. My mother had a gift I didn't fully understand until I was an adult. She could look at a set of numbers and immediately feel where the danger was. Not calculate it, feel it, like a musician who hears an off note before they can name it. She taught me everything she knew. I studied finance at a state school on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs, graduated with honors, and took a junior analyst position at a firm in Pittsburgh that most people have never heard of because it operates entirely without the need for your attention. I learned there that the quietest money is always the most powerful money. The accounts that don't announce themselves, the portfolios that don't appear in magazines, the families that have been building for 3 generations and have no interest in being photographed doing it. I was good at my job. Then I was excellent. Then I became the kind of person that certain people called when they needed something handled that couldn't be discussed on a recorded line. By the time I met my husband, Marcus, at a charity event in Philadelphia 8 years ago, I was 31 years old, managing a private wealth division and sitting on the boards of 2 nonprofit foundations as a financial overseer. I wore simple clothes and drove a practical car, and when people asked what I did, I said I worked in finance, which is true in the same way that saying the ocean is wet is technically accurate. Marcus was wonderful. He is still wonderful. A structural engineer with an honest laugh and the kind of steadiness that makes you feel like the floor will hold. I loved him immediately, in that inconvenient way that catches you off guard. We were married within 2 years in a small ceremony that his family considered underwhelming and that I considered exactly right. His family, I should describe them. His mother, Patricia, was a retired school principal who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room she entered and had not yet adjusted to the fact that retirement had altered this dynamic. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who used social hierarchy as a navigation system. And she had assessed me early and placed me on a lower shelf. And that placement had calcified into fact in her mind. His sister Danielle was 34 when this story takes place, a year younger than me, beautiful in the aggressive way that requires maintenance and witnesses, and engaged to a man named Brent Calloway who came from what Patricia called a very established family, which meant they had a house in a good zip code and a name that appeared in the local business pages with some regularity. Danielle had been, for the entirety of my marriage to her brother, politely dismissive of me, not rude in ways that could be reported, rude in ways that required witnesses who were paying close attention. She forgot to include me in family photos and then laughed it off. She spoke to me in the slightly elevated tone people use with service staff. She mentioned, on more than one occasion in front of more than one person, that Marcus had dated so many interesting women before settling down. That word, settling. She worked it like a small blade. I had never responded to any of it. Not because I lacked the vocabulary. I am quite good with language. But because I understood, from long professional experience, that the most powerful position you can occupy is the one your opponent has not yet mapped. If Danielle believed I was small, that belief was an asset. Every day she underestimated me was another day I moved without friction. I kept my professional life almost entirely separate from my marriage. Not out of deception, Marcus knew everything about what I did, was proud of it in that quiet way of his, and had learned early on not to discuss it at family dinners because it made his mother uncomfortable to discover she had misjudged someone. I kept it separate because it was mine. because I had built it with my own hands and my mother's mathematics and 10 years of 18-hour days, and it did not need to be placed on a table to justify my presence anywhere. Until the night of the engagement dinner, I had never felt any particular pressure to change that approach. The engagement dinner was held at Rosalind's, a restaurant in Center City, Philadelphia that Patricia had selected because it was the kind of place that appeared in the right publications and required reservations made months in advance. Danielle was radiant in a cream dress that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and she moved through the room the way she always moved, like someone who expected the lighting to cooperate. We were 11 at the table, Marcus and me, Patricia, Danielle and Brent, Brent's parents Gerald and Susan Calloway, two of Danielle's closest friends from college, and Marcus's cousin Reeves, who I'd always liked because he laughed at things that were actually funny. Dinner was fine. The food was good. The conversation was the kind that happens at these events. Polished, slightly performative, everyone showing their best angle. I was quiet, as I usually am in these settings, because I find that listening is almost always more informative than talking. It was during dessert that it happened. Brent's mother, Susan, had been asking about the wedding plans, and Danielle was describing the venue, a restored estate property outside the city, the same kind of venue that required coordinators and contracts and significant deposits, and she mentioned offhandedly that she had used a wedding planning service, a boutique firm, to handle the logistics. Patricia mentioned that the guest list was going to be significant, and someone asked how many people, and Danielle said 240, and there was an appreciative murmur around the table. Then Susan Calloway, who was the kind of woman who asked pointed questions while appearing to make conversation, said pleasantly, "And what does everyone do? Marcus, I know you're in engineering. Caroline, I don't think we've properly talked about what you do." I opened my mouth, and Danielle spoke first. "Oh, Caroline works in finance." She said it with a little wave of her hand, dismissive as brushing crumbs. "Something administrative, I think. Back office." And then she turned back to Susan with a more engaged expression and said, "But Brent has been so wonderful about the financial planning for the wedding. He really stepped up." There was a small, appreciative laugh from Susan. And then Danielle looked at me, and in that moment, I believe she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, had been building toward it through 7 years of small dismissals. She looked at me directly and said clearly and pleasantly the words I started with. "You know, no one would notice if you simply weren't here anymore. You've always been a bit disposable." She said it like an observation, like she was describing the centerpiece. Marcus stiffened next to me. I felt it. His hand moved toward mine under the table, and I touched his fingers briefly, a signal we'd developed over years. "I have this. Do not move." I smiled, took my sip of water, set the glass down, said nothing. Reeves stared at the tablecloth. Patricia looked at her dessert. The two college friends examined the middle distance with sudden intensity. Gerald Calloway cleared his throat. Danielle seemed pleased. She turned the conversation smoothly elsewhere, the way someone does when they've delivered a line and are satisfied with the landing. And I spent the rest of the evening exactly as I had spent the beginning of it. Quiet, attentive, pleasant. I asked Susan about a garden project she'd mentioned earlier. I complimented the wine. I was present without demanding anything from the presents. On the drive home, Marcus was furious in that controlled way of his, jaw tight, hands careful on the wheel. "I'm going to say something to her," he said. "No," I said. "Caroline." "Marcus." I looked at him in the passing light of the highway. "Do you trust me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, completely. "Then let me handle it." He didn't ask how. He knew, by then, that when I said those words, the appropriate response was to clear the field and let me work. He had seen it once before, 3 years earlier, when a business partner tried to cut him out of a project he'd spent 18 months developing. I had not raised my voice once during that particular situation. I had simply made 4 phone calls and reviewed 2 contracts, and within 6 weeks, the partner had reversed positions so completely that he credited Marcus in the project's final presentation. Marcus understood that I operated differently than most people. He found it more remarkable than I did, honestly. To me, it was just how you moved through the world if you paid attention and kept records. I kept records. This requires some explanation, and I want to give it properly because it matters to what happened next. 4 months before the engagement dinner, Danielle had come to me with a request. She had not come to me as a sister, warmly and with gratitude. She had come to me with the particular manner she reserved for asking favors from people she considered beneath her, brisk, slightly impatient, as if the ask itself was a courtesy she was extending to me. Brent's family, she explained, had strong opinions about the wedding venue. The estate property she had selected, Halcyon House, a beautifully restored property in Chester County, was family-owned by a small hospitality group. The availability for her preferred date was uncertain. There were other couples interested. The deposit structure was complex. She needed someone to look over the contract, as she put it, before they committed. I looked it over. What I found was a contract that had been drafted by someone who understood hospitality and had limited understanding of the particular vulnerabilities that create exposure in event venue agreements. There were clauses that appeared standard and were not. There was language around cancellation that seemed like boilerplate and contained, buried in its third paragraph, a provision that I found immediately notable. The cancellation terms included a right of first refusal clause tied to a specific external financing condition. This matters. Stay with me. The venue, Halcyon House, was owned by a family hospitality group called Meridian Event Properties. I knew this name. I knew it not because of Danielle's wedding, but because Meridian Event Properties had, 14 months earlier, been the subject of a quiet restructuring conversation involving a larger real estate investment entity. And I knew about that conversation because I had been one of 3 advisors brought in by the larger entity to assess the acquisition. The acquisition had not gone through, but in the process of that work, I had reviewed Meridian's financials, their debt structure, their asset holdings, and their contractual obligations across all 12 of their properties. I knew their balance sheet better than some of their own board members did. More specifically, I knew that Meridian's flagship financing agreement with their primary lender included a covenant, a restriction, that limited their ability to enter into event contracts above a certain value threshold with parties who had a direct financial relationship with certain competing entities. It was an obscure clause, the kind that gets written into financing agreements by cautious lawyers and then sits dormant for years because no one ever finds themselves in exactly the right set of circumstances to activate it. Danielle and Brent's contract with Halcyon House was valued, with catering and extended services, at just over $400,000. Brent Calloway's family business, the business that gave the Calloway name its local presence and gave Susan her confidence at dinner tables, was a mid-sized commercial real estate company. That company had, 2 years ago, entered into a joint venture agreement with a firm that Meridian's lender had specifically identified in their covenant language. The connection was indirect, but it was there. I had seen it in the documents. I had noted it at the time as an interesting liability and filed it away in the part of my mind where I keep things that might one day become useful. I want to be precise here because I want you to understand what I did and did not do. I did not forge anything. I did not manipulate any documents. I did not do anything illegal or improper. I reviewed existing documents and I understood what they meant, and I had the professional expertise to know who needed to be informed and how. On the Monday after the engagement dinner, I made a phone call. The call was to a colleague at the investment firm that had been Meridian's primary lender during the restructuring conversations. We were friendly, the kind of professional friendship built on mutual respect and shared discretion. I mentioned, in the careful language our industry uses for these conversations, that I had recently become aware of a potential covenant issue involving one of Meridian's active event contracts. I mentioned the specific covenant. I provided the relevant details regarding the Calloway family's business relationship. I did not tell him what to do with the information. I simply made sure the right person had it. These things move quickly when they move. By Wednesday, Meridian's legal team had been contacted by the lender's compliance office. By Thursday, Meridian was reviewing the contract. By Friday afternoon, their counsel had determined that the covenant issue presented a real risk and that the contract, as structured, created liability they were not comfortable carrying. Halcyon House notified Danielle and Brent that Friday evening that they were canceling the event agreement, effective immediately, and refunding the deposit in full in accordance with their cancellation terms. 240 guests, 8 months of planning, the venue that Danielle had announced in her engagement photos, the name she had put on the save the dates that had already been mailed, the place she had described in the kind of detail that makes clear it wasn't just a location but a statement, gone. I was at home when she called. It was 9 o'clock on a Friday night. Marcus was reading in the living room, and I was reviewing a quarterly report at the kitchen table when my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring. Then I answered, "Did you have something to do with this?" Her voice was different than it had been at dinner. The pleasantness was gone. She sounded like what she was in that moment, a woman whose carefully constructed plans had just collapsed and who needed somewhere to put the weight of that. "Hello, Danielle," I said. "Don't?" The venue canceled, out of nowhere. They said there's some financing issue. I need to know if you did something. I was quiet for a moment, not because I was building a performance. I was genuinely deciding how honest to be. You asked me to review your contract, I said. I did. I found an issue that I was professionally obligated to flag to the relevant parties. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. What does that mean? What are you saying? It means that the contract had a problem, Danielle. A real one, not one I created. One that existed before I ever saw the document. If the venue had proceeded and the lender had discovered the covenant issue after the event, Meridian could have faced significant financial consequences. I actually protected them by making sure the issue was identified early. You destroyed my wedding. I identified a contract liability. What Meridian chose to do with that information was their decision. They had every legal right to cancel. You'll get your deposit back. There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed again. It was smaller, more jagged. There's no way to get that date back? The venue is booked solid for 2 years. We already sent save the dates. I know, I said. I'm sorry that this is hard. I genuinely hope you and Brent find a beautiful venue. There are many wonderful options. Another silence. Why? She finally said. Is this because of what I said at dinner? And this is the part I thought about most carefully in the days before this conversation happened, because I knew it would come and I had decided how I wanted to answer it. No, I said, and I meant it. This is because you handed me a contract with a material defect and asked me to review it in my professional capacity. The rest of it, what you said at dinner, the years before that, that's between you and your own conscience. I don't need anything from you, Danielle. I never have. I could hear her breathing. But I'll tell you something, I continued. If you had treated me like a person, I would have resolved this differently. When I found the issue, I would have come to you privately, explained it, helped you renegotiate or find a solution that protected everyone. That is what I do for people I care about. But you made a choice about who I was to you a long time ago. So I made a choice about where my professional obligations lay. She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and then set it on the table and went back to the quarterly report. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. That was Danielle, I said. I know. The venue canceled. He looked at me for a long moment. Contract issue? Covenant violation? Very clear-cut. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details. He sat down across from me and was quiet for a while. The comfortable quiet of two people who know each other deeply. Then he said, She should have known better. She didn't know who I was, I said. People usually don't. I knew, he said. I smiled at him. The real kind. What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic in the way that Danielle might have expected drama to look. There were no confrontations. No family meetings where I was called to account. Patricia called Marcus, not me, and Marcus told her simply that I had done my job and that if his sister had questions about contract law, she could consult an attorney. Danielle and Brent did find another venue. A hotel ballroom, quite nice, though not the statement that Halcyon House would have been. The wedding was rescheduled by 4 months. The save the dates required an update card. At the family Christmas gathering that year, 2 months after the engagement dinner, I was present as I always am. I brought a dish. I sat at the table. I was pleasant and warm and engaged with everyone, including Danielle, who was careful with me in a way she had never been careful before. She said my name when she spoke to me. She looked at me directly. She did not say anything cutting. I was the same person I had always been. That was the point. Reeves found me in the kitchen while I was helping with dishes and leaned against the counter with a glass of wine and looked at me with that expression he had, the one that suggested he had been paying closer attention than anyone gave him credit for. You know, he said, I've always thought you were the most interesting person in this family. Thank you, Reeves. Did you know about the contract thing before dinner? I turned to look at him. He was smiling a little, not accusatory, genuinely curious, the way someone who appreciates a well-played game will ask about the strategy after it's over. I knew what I knew, I said. I made decisions based on what was in front of me. He laughed, quietly, with real appreciation. Yeah, he said. That's what I thought. He raised his glass slightly. I raised mine. I want to talk about Danielle for a moment, not with bitterness, because I genuinely don't carry bitterness about this. I carry clarity, which is different. Bitterness is a weight, clarity is a tool. Danielle had spent years operating from a particular understanding of the world. That value is visible, that it is worn and announced and requires witnesses, and that people who do not perform their value loudly are therefore without it. She had looked at me and seen a quiet woman in practical clothes who worked in finance in some back office capacity. And she had made decisions based on that assessment, and those decisions had consequences. She was not a monster. She was a person who had never been taught to look carefully, and who had been given enough social reward for not looking carefully that she'd had no reason to develop the skill. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and I find explanations more useful than condemnations. What I wanted her to understand, and what I believe she did understand after, was not that I was more powerful than her. Power as a competition has never interested me. What I wanted her to understand was that the world does not organize itself according to who is most visible, that the people who hold the actual architecture of things are often the ones you walked past in the hallway without really seeing. That disposable is a word that reveals more about the person using it than the person it's aimed at. I think about my mother sometimes during all of this. About her at that kitchen desk, running the numbers for businesses that depended on her precision, and how the owners of those businesses probably did not think of her as essential, probably thought of her as reliable in the way that infrastructure is reliable, something you notice only when it fails, and how she never seemed bothered by that. How she would look up from her desk sometimes and say, with complete satisfaction, "If they knew how much I actually see, they'd be afraid." I understood that better after. My professional life continued as it always had. The situation with Danielle never intersected with it directly. I had been careful to ensure that the phone call I made was grounded entirely in legitimate professional grounds, because I do not operate in any other way. The colleague I called has since referred to it on the one occasion it came up obliquely in conversation, as a solid catch on a tricky covenant. Which it was. Marcus and I are well. We took a trip to Portugal in the spring, just the two of us, and walked along the coast and ate good food and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. He told me on the last night that he was proud of me not just for how I'd handled it, but for who I was in it. "You didn't become anyone different," he said. "You just stayed yourself." That meant more to me than most things. Danielle's wedding was in June. We attended. I wore a deep green dress that I had purchased with no particular strategy in mind. I just liked the color, and I sat at the family table and was warm and present. Danielle in her dress was genuinely beautiful. I told her so before the ceremony and meant it. She looked at me for a moment with something complicated in her expression, and then she said quietly, "Thank you for coming." Like she was surprised I had, like she was grateful in a way she didn't quite know how to carry. "Of course," I said. "Family? I don't know what her understanding of me is now. I don't require her to have one. I don't need to be seen by Danielle, and I don't need her to spend the rest of her life regretting what she said at that dinner table. What happened, happened. What I did, and we are all, as far as I can tell, living with the version of the world those choices produced, which seems like the appropriate outcome." The thing about power, real power, the kind that doesn't need a room to confirm it, is that it doesn't consume itself in the proving. It simply exists. It is patient. It knows what it knows, and it waits for the moment when what it knows becomes relevant. I am not in the business of announcing myself. I am in the business of outcomes. I think about the word she used, disposable. I have turned it over many times, looked at it from different angles, tried to find anything in it that landed. And what I keep coming back to is this. She was describing a thing she believed was interchangeable, without specific value, replaceable without consequence. She looked at me and saw something she could set aside. What she didn't understand, what she couldn't have understood, because she had chosen not to look, was that I was the one person in that extended family ecosystem who understood the precise contractual and financial architecture of a specific high-value agreement that was central to the most important event of her near future. That I had the professional knowledge to identify its vulnerabilities and the professional connections to have those vulnerabilities addressed. She had handed me the instrument and named me disposable in the same season. There is a lesson in that, I think. Not a cruel one, just a real one. The most dangerous person in any room is often the one you decided not to see. I set down my water glass that evening at Rosalind's with perfect steadiness, and I smiled, and I said nothing, and I went home and I slept well, and in the morning I went to work and I did my job with the same precision I have always brought to it. And the world, as it tends to do when you understand its actual mechanisms, adjusted accordingly. Some people announce themselves. Others simply arrange the outcome. I have always preferred to be the kind of woman who, when she finally moves, makes you realize she was never where you thought she was standing.